Harlem in the early 1930s did not wake gently. It stirred like a tired fighter rising before dawn, bruised but unwilling to stay down. The Great Depression pressed hard against its ribs, and yet music still spilled from apartment windows. Children still chased each other across cracked pavement. Women still leaned from fire, escapes calling sons home before dark. And men still measured one another not by wealth, but by presence. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson walked those streets with a pace that never hurried and never lagged. He did not move like a man who needed to prove something. He moved like a man who understood that every step carried weight. His suits were pressed, his shoes polished, his hat angled just enough to shield his eyes without hiding them. People stepped aside not because they feared him, but because they respected what he represented. Steadiness in a world that had lost its balance. In those days, Harlem existed in two realities. One was visible bright lights, jazz clubs, storefront, churches, newspapers celebrating black excellence and resilience. The other reality was quieter and more dangerous economic exploitation, discriminatory policing, banks that denied loans to hardworking families, hospital wards separated not by need but by color. Harlem survived through community because the system rarely offered mercy. Bumpy understood that deeply. He had grown up understanding that dignity was something you carried inside, because the outside world might refuse to recognize it. He read poetry. He studied philosophy. He observed people carefully. He spoke little and listened often. And when he did speak, his words carried clarity. 3 nights before the incident that would change everything, Bumpy had attended a tense meeting downtown. Dutch Schultz, polished and sharp-eyed, had entered the room with confidence bordering on arrogance. Dutch was a product of a different America, one where doors opened more easily, where protection was assumed, where influence often followed. Heritage. He had built power through intimidation and manipulation, and he understood leverage as currency. Their meeting was meant to be a negotiation over territory, not just physical space, but economic opportunity. Harlem's businesses were beginning to stabilize despite the Depression. Local grocers, tailors, and club owners were holding their ground. Dutch saw potential profit. Bumpy saw community survival. The air in that room had been thick with tension. Dutch spoke in statements. Bumpy responded in principles. "You're standing in the way of progress." Dutch had said smoothly, fingers drumming against polished oak, "I'm standing in the way of exploitation." Bumpy replied, his tone level. Dutch smiled thinly. "You think you can control what flows through this city?" "No," Bumpy answered, "but I can decide what flows through Harlem." It was not shouted. It was not aggressive. It was calm certainty. And that calm unsettled Dutch more than defiance would have. When Bumpy left that meeting, Harlem felt different. Word spread quietly that pressure might follow. And pressure did follow, but not in the way most expected. First came the inspections. Health officials suddenly scrutinized black-owned establishments with renewed intensity. Then came supply delays. Deliveries that had once arrived reliably began disappearing in transit. Harlem Hospital reported a shortage of basic medical equipment. No official connection could be proven, but patterns rarely lie. Bumpy noticed. He did not retaliate. He did not threaten. He did not posture. Instead, he visited the hospital quietly one afternoon, walking past crowded waiting rooms and understaffed wards. He watched nurses stretch limited resources. He observed a young intern stitching wounds beneath flickering lights. He saw mothers waiting anxiously beside iron-framed beds. This was not business rivalry anymore. This was cruelty disguised as strategy. And cruelty, Bumpy believed, revealed weakness. He left the hospital that day with something heavier than anger. He carried responsibility. Harlem's dignity was not abstract. It lived in those hospital beds, in those grocery aisles, in the hopeful eyes of children running barefoot between buildings. 2 days later, rain began falling over the city in a steady curtain that blurred street lamps into trembling halos. Bumpy was leaving a small church gathering when he heard it, the faint sound of labored breathing echoing between brick walls. He paused. Most men would have walked past. Rain muffles. Urgency. But Bumpy had learned long ago that the smallest sounds sometimes carry the greatest weight. He followed the sound into a narrow alley where trash barrels overflowed and shadows gathered thickly. There, half collapsed against a crate, lay a boy, dressed in clothes too fine for the neighborhood. His coat was soaked through, his breathing shallow. One hand clutched his side where blood had begun seeping through fabric. For a split second, Bumpy assessed the scene like a chessboard. No obvious attackers, no witnesses. Just rain and a boy who did not belong there. Then he saw the ring, a signet. Ring engraved with initials recognizable to anyone familiar with downtown influence. Dutch Schultz's son. There are moments in life when history seems to hold its breath. This was one of them. Here lay the child of the man applying pressure to Harlem's survival. Fate had delivered leverage directly into Bumpy's hands. He could have left him. He could have called anonymously and stepped away. He could have allowed coincidence to settle accounts. Instead, Bumpy removed his coat and knelt. "Stay with me," he said quietly, his voice steady against the rain. The boy's eyelids fluttered weakly. Fear flickered there, not recognition, but confusion. Pain makes everyone equal. "Elijah," Bumpy called calmly to his driver. "Bring the car around." Elijah froze briefly when he recognized the ring. "Mr. Johnson." I know," Bumpy replied. "Move." There was no hesitation in his tone, only decision. They lifted the boy carefully into the back seat. Bumpy pressed firm, but controlled pressure against the wound while speaking evenly to keep him conscious. He did not lecture. He did not reveal identity. He simply anchored the boy with calm words. "Breathe slow," he instructed. "Rain sounds louder than it is. Focus on that." The drive to Harlem Hospital was quick but careful. Nurses rushed forward immediately, startled by the sight of Bumpy Johnson carrying an unconscious white child through the doors. Recognition spread quickly. Whispers began, but Bumpy did not explain himself. He simply ensured the boy was taken into surgery without delay. Then he waited. Rain tapped softly against hospital windows as tension thickened in the corridor. Minutes felt like hours. Elijah shifted uneasily. "This will reach his father." Elijah murmured, "It should." Bumpy answered, and it did. Dutch Schultz arrived breathless and pale, stripped of polish and performance. For the first time, he did not enter a room as a strategist. He entered as a father. He saw Bumpy standing quietly near the wall, hat in hand. The silence between them was heavy, but not hostile. "You found him," Dutch said at last. Yes. "You knew who he was." "Yes. And you still—" "Yes." Bumpy did not elaborate. He did not grandstand. He did not request concession. Dutch stared at him, pride and confusion warring behind his eyes. "You expect something," Dutch said, trying to regain footing. "I expect the doctors to do their job." Bumpy replied. That was the moment the power shifted. Not through dominance, not through threat, but through moral clarity. When the surgeon emerged and confirmed the boy would live, Dutch exhaled like a man who had briefly glimpsed the edge of irreversible loss. He turned to Bumpy slowly. "You could have left him," he said quietly. Bumpy met his gaze without triumph. A child doesn't inherit his father's conflicts. It was not accusation. It was truth. Dutch lowered his eyes, not dramatically, not theatrically, but enough. That night something subtle changed in Harlem and downtown alike. Within days, hospital shipments resumed without delay. Inspections ceased abruptly. Pressure evaporated as quietly as it had begun. No public apology was issued. No handshake photographed. But when Dutch next crossed paths with Bumpy on Lenox Avenue, He removed his hat first. And that gesture traveled through Harlem like sunlight, breaking through storm clouds. Because strength, real strength, is revealed not in retaliation, but in restraint. Harlem did not celebrate what Bumpy Johnson had done. It absorbed it. That was the nature of the neighborhood. Triumph was rarely loud there. Survival left little room for applause. Still, something shifted in the air after that rain-soaked night. Men spoke more carefully. Women looked a little steadier when walking their children to school. Even the police cars rolling slowly down Lenox Avenue seemed, for a time, less certain of themselves. Mercy, when delivered by a man who could have chosen vengeance, unsettled the usual order of things, but mercy has a cost. And power, when challenged without violence, often responds with something colder. Downtown, Dutch Schultz returned to his routines with a changed posture. His son recovered quickly, the doctors later said, because someone had brought him in early. Enough. Dutch never spoke publicly about who that someone was. Publicly, he returned to business. Privately, he slept less. Gratitude for a man like Dutch was a dangerous emotion. It loosened the armor he had spent a lifetime building. And gratitude mixed with humiliation curdled into something sharper. He had been outmaneuvered without even being attacked. That, more than any threat, gnawed at him. Bumpy sensed the change before it arrived in action. He always did. He noticed it in the way certain messengers stopped coming. In the way familiar signals from downtown grew inconsistent, erratic. Mercy had not softened Dutch's world, it had exposed it. And exposed men often strike back in ways that do not leave fingerprints. The first blow did not come to Bumpy directly. It came to a man named Samuel Green, a quiet bookkeeper who handled accounts for several Harlem-owned businesses. Samuel was the sort of man who believed numbers could protect him. He kept meticulous records. He followed every rule. One evening, as he was locking his office, 2 officers stopped him for questioning. There was no warrant, no clear accusation. Just suspicion, delivered with authority and a smirk. By morning, Samuel was in a holding cell, accused of financial irregularities that did not exist. His books were seized. His office sealed. Businesses across Harlem found their accounts frozen. Overnight, grocers could not restock. Club owners could not pay musicians. Families felt the impact before they even understood the cause. Bumpy visited Samuel in custody that afternoon. The man looked smaller behind the bars, not because he was weak, but because the system had been designed to shrink men like him. Samuel spoke in a low voice, careful, afraid that even truth might be dangerous. "They want names," he whispered. "They want me to say you're behind something illegal." Bumpy listened without interrupting. When Samuel finished, Bumpy placed a hand on the bars, his expression composed, his eyes steady. "You haven't done anything wrong," Bumpy said quietly. "And you won't say you have." "They can keep me here," Samuel replied, fear cracking his voice, "indefinitely." Bumpy nodded once. "Then they'll have to explain why." Outside the station, Elijah asked the question many were thinking. "Is this because of the boy?" Bumpy did not answer immediately. He looked up at the gray sky hanging low over the city. "It's because mercy disrupts hierarchy," he said finally. "Some men can forgive an enemy. They can't forgive being reminded they're human." Pressure mounted quickly after that. Harlem's hospital received another inspection. This time, officials claimed budgetary review. Wards were threatened with closure. Supplies were audited again. Each move was legal on paper, cruel in effect. It was punishment delivered through procedure. Community leaders urged Bumpy to respond. Some wanted confrontation. Others wanted negotiation. All of them feared escalation. Bumpy called them together in a church basement one evening, the same place where men had once planned protests and prayer meetings side by side. He listened as voices rose, frustration spilling over. When the room finally quieted, he spoke. "They want noise," he said calmly. "Noise gives them justification. We won't give it to them." "Then what do we give them?" one man asked. Bitterly, Bumpy met his gaze. Time and truth. It was not a popular answer. Time felt like surrender to people who were hurting now. But Bumpy understood something they did not yet see. Systems that abuse power rely on impatience. They provoke reaction so they can redefine victims as aggressors. Meanwhile, Dutch Schultz faced his own private conflict. His son, still pale but healing, asked questions Dutch could not answer easily. "Why did that man help me?" the boy asked one night. "You said he was dangerous." Dutch had no response ready. He dismissed the question, but it lingered. Children have a way of dismantling lies simply by existing. Unable to reconcile his debt, doubled down. He pushed harder behind the scenes, leveraging political connections to tighten scrutiny on Harlem's finances. But each move produced diminishing returns. Community organizations documented everything. Clergy wrote letters. Newspapers began asking careful questions. Not accusations questions. And questions made people nervous. The turning point came unexpectedly, as such moments often do. A winter storm struck the city hard, freezing pipes, knocking out power in several neighborhoods. Harlem Hospital lost electricity for nearly an hour before generators kicked in. In that hour, a patient in critical condition nearly died. The story reached the press within days. Reporters began digging into why a major hospital serving thousands was operating with such fragile infrastructure. Files surfaced. Delayed shipments. Budget cuts that made no sense. Patterns that suggested deliberate neglect. Bumpy did not leak anything he did not need to. Truth, once cornered, tends to escape on its own. A closed-door meeting was called downtown. Politicians, businessmen, intermediaries. Dutch was there, his usual confidence dulled by the realization that his quiet war had become visible. And visibility was dangerous. Bumpy arrived last as always. He listened as explanations were offered, as blame was redirected, as words filled the room without resolving anything. Finally, someone asked the question directly. "What do you want, Johnson?" Bumpy adjusted his cuff slowly before answering. "I want the hospital funded properly. I want Samuel Green released and his name cleared. And I want Harlem's businesses left alone. And if we don't?" Someone asked. Bumpy looked at Dutch then, not challengingly, not triumphantly, simply steadily. "Then the questions will keep coming, and they won't be mine." Silence followed. The kind of silence that acknowledges inevitability. By the end of the week, Samuel was released. Charges quietly dropped. Funds were restored. Hospital generators were upgraded. No press conference announced the changes. But Harlem noticed. Dutch avoided Bumpy for months after that. When they finally crossed paths again, there was no hostility left, only something heavier. Respect, perhaps, or resignation. Bumpy did not savor it. He never did. Power exercised for dignity does not need celebration. He returned to his routines, walked his streets, spoke softly, watched carefully, because mercy had not made him weak. It had made him undeniable. And in a city that thrived on force and fear, that was the most dangerous position of all. By the winter of 1935, Harlem had grown used to surviving storms. Economic storms, political storms. Storms of insult and injustice that rolled in without warning and lingered longer than they should have. But there was another kind of storm building now, quieter, more personal, and far more dangerous. It was the storm that forms when pride is wounded, when gratitude curdles into resentment, and when men accustomed to control begin to fear losing it. Bumpy Johnson sensed it before anyone else did. He felt it in the way conversations paused when certain names were mentioned, in the way unfamiliar faces lingered too long on corners, in the way Dutch Schultz's men stopped moving through Harlem not as challengers, but as observers. Observation, Bumpy knew, was preparation. Mercy had saved a child. It had shifted public opinion. It had forced powerful men to reconsider how openly they could manipulate Harlem's survival. But it had also done something else. It had placed Bumpy Johnson in a moral position so strong that any direct attack would appear petty, even vindictive. And men like Dutch did not like being cornered without a clear opponent to fight. So they changed tactics. Instead of pressure from above, it began from within. One evening, as the Apollo's marquee flickered proudly against the cold, rumors began spreading through the crowd. Whispered stories of betrayal. Claims that Bumpy had struck secret deals downtown. That he had leveraged Harlem's hardship for his own influence. That his calm exterior masked ambition no different from the men he opposed. Rumors are more dangerous than bullets. They travel faster and leave fewer traces. Bumpy heard about the whispers the next morning. Elijah relayed them cautiously, watching his employer's expression for signs of anger. But Bumpy did not flare. He did not pace. He did not demand names. Who benefits? He asked quietly. Elijah frowned. From what? From doubt. The answer did not need to be spoken. Divide a community, and you weaken its backbone. Erode trust, and you erase authority without firing a shot. Within weeks, small tensions began surfacing. A shopkeeper questioned whether Bumpy had truly refused concessions downtown. A church deacon wondered aloud why certain city officials seemed less hostile lately. Seeds of suspicion, carefully planted. Bumpy chose not to confront the rumors publicly. Instead, he increased his visibility. He attended community meetings he might have otherwise skipped. He spent evenings listening to grievances without defending himself. He answered questions calmly, even when they were edged with doubt, because he understood something fundamental. Trust, once earned honestly, does not crumble under wind. It only falls if the foundation was false to begin with. Still, the storm gathered. One night, a fire broke out in a tenement building near 135th Street. Flames tore through wooden beams as residents scrambled down narrow staircases. Firefighters arrived late. Too late for one family. The building had recently failed. An inspection that city officials had delayed addressing for months. The next morning, headlines spoke of tragedy. But within Harlem, conversations turned toward accountability. Why had repairs not been enforced? Why had safety concerns been ignored? And then, quietly, someone leaked a document showing that funds allocated for building maintenance had been diverted weeks earlier to projects benefiting properties tied to downtown investors. The anger this time was not abstract. It was personal. Crowds gathered outside City Hall. Clergy demanded answers. The press intensified its scrutiny, and in the shadows, Dutch Schultz watched carefully. He had not ordered the fire. He had not orchestrated the tragedy. But he had benefited from a system that redirected resources away from Harlem. Now that system was under fire. And at the center of the narrative stood Bumpy Johnson, a man who had become synonymous with moral resistance. Dutch faced a choice: align quietly with reform or undermine the man who symbolized it. He chose the latter. An anonymous letter reached several newspapers accusing Bumpy of exploiting the tragedy to consolidate power. It suggested, without evidence, that he had known about the diverted funds and used the information strategically. The accusation was absurd to those who knew him. But doubt thrives in crisis. When a reporter approached Bumpy for comment, microphones poised eagerly, he did not lash out. He did not insult. He did not accuse in return. Instead, he said only this: if anyone has evidence that I have taken from Harlem instead of given to it, they should present it. If not, we should focus on rebuilding. It was a short statement, calm, controlled, but powerful. Because he did not defend his character with anger, he invited scrutiny. Meanwhile, something else was happening quietly. Dutch's son, still recovering fully from his injuries months earlier, had begun sneaking visits to Harlem, curious, restless, perhaps seeking something he did not fully understand. One afternoon, he found himself outside a bookstore where Bumpy often spent time reading. The boy entered hesitantly. Bumpy looked up from a volume of poetry and recognized him immediately. "You look stronger," Bumpy observed gently. The boy nodded. "I wanted to thank you, properly." Bumpy closed the book. "You don't owe me anything. My father says I do." Bumpy studied the boy carefully. "Then your father misunderstands." "I did what any man should." The boy hesitated. "Not every man would." Bumpy smiled faintly. "Then perhaps more men should." Unbeknownst to both of them, someone had followed the boy. A photographer. A man paid quietly to capture moments that could be twisted. The next morning, an image appeared in a downtown paper. Bumpy Johnson and Dutch Schultz's son, seated across from one another in a Harlem bookstore. The headline implied secret alliance, implied manipulation, suggested that Bumpy had gained leverage over Dutch through personal access. The city buzzed. Dutch saw the image before noon. Fury flared not at Bumpy alone, but at himself. He had tried to distance himself from the debt of gratitude. Now it looked as though that debt was public spectacle. He confronted Bumpy later that week, not in a back room this time, but in an open restaurant on neutral ground. "You're using my son," Dutch said, voice low but shaking with contained anger. Bumpy remained seated, unhurried. "Your son walked into a bookstore. You think this makes you untouchable?" Bumpy met his eyes steadily. "Nothing makes a man untouchable, but truth makes him difficult to destroy." Dutch leaned closer. "You're turning public opinion. I'm letting it form on its own." The confrontation might have escalated. Pride might have demanded more, but something stopped Dutch this time. Perhaps the memory of rain. Perhaps the knowledge that escalation would only prove Bumpy's point. He straightened slowly. "This isn't over." Bumpy nodded once. "It never is." The weeks that followed were tense. Protests grew larger. Investigations widened. Downtown investors began distancing themselves from questionable allocations. Political figures, sensing the shift in public mood, adjusted their tone. But the true turning point came not through exposure or confrontation, but through a single, decisive act. A city council hearing was scheduled to address the diversion of maintenance funds. Community leaders were invited to testify. Bumpy's name was on the list. Many expected him to deliver a fiery speech, to condemn, to accuse, to demand retribution. Instead, when his turn came, he walked to the podium calmly, adjusted the microphone, and spoke in measured tones. "I'm not here to accuse individuals," he began. "I'm here to remind this council that when resources are diverted from vulnerable communities, people die, not politically, not metaphorically, literally." The room quieted. "Harlem does not ask for special treatment," he continued. "We ask for equal treatment. If buildings are unsafe, repair them. If hospitals lack funding, supply them. If inspections are delayed, prioritize lives over profit." He paused then, letting the silence deepen. "And if anyone believes this request threatens their influence, I invite them to reconsider what influence is for." There was no anger, no theatrics. Only truth. The hearing concluded without spectacle, but within weeks, reforms were announced. Funding audits were implemented. Oversight committees established. Dutch watched from a distance as the city adjusted, not because of violence, not because of intimidation, but because one man refused to abandon composure. For the first time, Dutch understood something fundamental. Bumpy Johnson was not dangerous because he commanded fear. He was dangerous because he commanded respect, and respect, once earned publicly, cannot be easily dismantled. As winter thawed into early spring, Harlem breathed a little easier. Buildings were repaired. The hospital stabilized. Businesses reopened accounts without interference, but Bumpy did not celebrate because storms do not end. They evolve, and somewhere in the shifting political winds of New York City, a final test was forming, one that would challenge not just his authority, but his identity. He sensed it in the air, and he prepared. By the spring of 1935, Harlem no longer felt like a neighborhood under siege. It felt like a neighborhood under watch. The repairs were visible. Fresh brick replaced charred beams. Hospital generators hummed with steadier reliability. Inspections came and went without harassment. On paper, progress had been made. But paper had never told the full story of Harlem. Progress, Bumpy knew, was not measured in documents. It was measured in dignity. And dignity is fragile when power feels cornered. Dutch Schultz had grown quieter in recent months. Not withdrawn, never withdrawn, but recalibrated. The newspapers had shifted tone. The public hearings had tightened oversight. His name had not been publicly condemned, but it had hovered in enough rooms to make him uncomfortable. And discomfort breeds calculation. He had learned something about Bumpy Johnson. Direct opposition strengthened him. Public confrontation elevated him. Violence would martyr him. Dutch did not want a martyr. He wanted control restored. So he chose a strategy colder than intimidation. He chose erasure. Downtown investors quietly began consolidating properties along the outer edges of Harlem, not aggressively, not loudly. Gradually, buildings were purchased through intermediaries. Leases adjusted. Longtime tenants offered buyouts too small to relocate comfortably. On the surface, it was development. Beneath the surface, it was displacement. The plan was subtle. Reshape Harlem economically until its backbone bent without ever appearing to break it. Bumpy noticed the pattern within weeks. He studied deeds. He listened to tenants. He walked blocks that felt different than they had months earlier. Fear had returned, but not fear of police raids or inspections. Fear of invisibility. One evening, an elderly woman named Mrs. Carter approached him outside her building. She had lived there 30 years, raised children there, buried a husband there. Now she held a folded notice in trembling hands. They say renovations, she whispered, temporary relocation. But I know what that means. Bumpy unfolded the notice slowly. Legal language, clean signatures. Perfectly valid. Who owns the building now? He asked. She named a company unfamiliar to most but not to Bumpy. A shell corporation linked to downtown interests. He nodded once. You won't leave, he said gently. Her eyes filled. How can you promise that? I'm not promising, he replied. I'm stating. That night, he called a meeting, not of businessmen, not of politicians, but of tenants, families, shopkeepers, teachers. He spoke plainly. They're not attacking us, he said. They're absorbing us, quietly. If we react loudly, they'll call it resistance to progress. If we ignore it, they'll call it market correction. Then, what do we do? Someone asked. Bumpy's answer came without hesitation. We buy. The room fell silent. With what? Another man demanded bitterly. We barely pay rent. With unity, Bumpy answered. Pooling resources, cooperative ownership. If they want to consolidate Harlem, we'll consolidate it first. It was an audacious plan, risky, complicated, but it reframed the battlefield. Within weeks, a cooperative fund began forming quietly. Contributions small but steady. Churches contributed from tithes. Musicians donated portions of performances. Shopkeepers added coins from register drawers. No headlines announced it. No banners advertised it. But momentum gathered. Dutch learned of the cooperative effort quickly. He did not laugh. He did not underestimate it. Instead, he accelerated acquisitions, hoping speed would outrun solidarity. Offers increased slightly. Pressure applied discreetly to families wavering on decisions. And then came the mistake. A letter surfaced misaddressed, delivered accidentally to the wrong office. It outlined long-term plans for cultural restructuring. Of Harlem, the language was sanitized, corporate. But the meaning was unmistakable. Displacement was intentional. The letter reached Bumpy's desk on a quiet afternoon. He read it once, twice, then folded it carefully and placed it inside his jacket. He did not leak it immediately. He did not storm. Downtown. He waited. Because timing is the difference between reaction and revelation. The opportunity arrived unexpectedly. When a gala was announced, a charity event for urban development, hosted by prominent investors and attended by city officials. Dutch Schultz's name was on the guest list. So was Bumpy Johnson's. The invitation to Bumpy had not been extended publicly. It had been delivered privately, perhaps as a test. Perhaps as a trap. He accepted. The ballroom shimmered under crystal chandeliers. Silk gowns brushed against polished floors. Jazz played softly from a distant corner. Conversations floated like perfume, light, insincere. Strategic. When Bumpy entered, heads turned. He did not dress louder than the room. He did not arrive with entourage. He moved with the same steady pace Harlem knew well. Calm, measured, UNBO to TRED. Dutch spotted him immediately, for a moment. The room felt smaller. They approached one another, not as enemies, but as men aware that history watched. "You're far from Lenox Avenue," Dutch observed coolly. Bumpy glanced around thoughtfully. "So are you." A thin smile flickered. The program began. Speeches about progress, about revitalization, about opportunity. Words carefully crafted to avoid mentioning who might be displaced in the process. Then, during a segment inviting community representation, Bumpy's name was announced. Murmurs rippled across the room. He stepped to the podium without hurry. "I've listened tonight to many promises." He began evenly. "Promises about development, investment, improvement." Polite applause. "I agree," he continued. "Communities deserve improvement, but improvement without inclusion is not progress. It is replacement." The air shifted. He reached inside his jacket and unfolded the letter carefully. "This document outlines plans to culturally restructure Harlem," he said, voice steady but firm. "To modernize it by encouraging current residents to relocate." A low wave of whispers spread through the crowd. "I believe transparency is healthy," Bumpy added calmly. "So I thought it only fair to share it." He handed copies prepared earlier to reporters. Seated near the stage, there was no shouting. No accusation of individuals. Only exposure. Dutch remained still, but tension coiled beneath his composure. He had not expected this. Not here. Not framed so simply. Bumpy continued. "Harlem is not an empty canvas," he said. "It is home. If investors wish to participate in its growth, they are welcome. But they will do so with us, not instead of us." He stepped back from the microphone. Silence. Then, unexpectedly, applause began, not thunderous, not explosive, but steady. Sustained. Dutch did not clap, but he did not interrupt either. After the event, in a quieter corridor away from the crowd, Dutch approached Bumpy one final time. "You're forcing my hand," Dutch said quietly. "I'm opening it." Bumpy replied. Dutch studied him carefully. "You could have destroyed reputations tonight." "I'm not interested in destruction." "Then what are you interested in?" Bumpy's answer came without hesitation. "Respect that doesn't require fear." There was no triumph in his voice. No arrogance. Only conviction. Dutch looked past him toward the ballroom, where reporters now clustered around investors demanding comment. The tide had shifted again, not violently, not chaotically, but undeniably. For a long moment, Dutch said nothing. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, he removed his hat. It was not theatrical. It was not dramatic. It was acknowledgement. A gesture between men who understood that power had been redefined. "You're not what I expected," Dutch admitted quietly. Bumpy met his gaze. Neither are you. Dutch's expression softened briefly, an unguarded flicker rarely seen. Take care of Harlem, he said. I always have. Bumpy replied, and that was the closest thing to a bow the city would ever witness. Not forced, not demanded. Earned. In the months that followed, cooperative ownership expanded. Displacement slowed. Investors negotiated rather than imposed. Harlem remained Harlem, not untouched by change, but included in it. And Bumpy Johnson returned to his routine. Walking, listening, reading. Poetry in quiet bookstores. Because the greatest victories are not the ones shouted from rooftops. They are the ones carried silently in posture. Years later, people would remember the night of the gala not as scandal, but as turning point. The night dignity stood in a ballroom of influence and refused to kneel. And somewhere in New York City, a man who once believed power came from control learned that true authority comes from restraint. Bumpy Johnson never asked anyone to bow. He simply lived in a way that made them reconsider standing tall without him.